Hello, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Makone Maja. Makone, how are you doing?
Good, thanks, Nick. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good, thank you very much. And also by Mr. Chris Hattingh. Chris, how are you?
Hi, Nick. Doing well, thanks. Bit of a CRA takeover today. Let's see if we can help you out.
It's an invasion. Soon you're going to replace me with some kind of business analyst, and I'll be horrified. Anyway,
One man's invaders, another man's freedom fighters.
All right, let's start. So today, of course, once again, we're going to be speaking a little bit about the ongoing fallout from the sort of de Ruyter ejection from Eskom, where Pravin Gordhan, the Minister of Public Enterprises, has come forward to say that he was told about the corruption allegations. He may, in fact, have been the senior minister referred to in that explosive interview that Andre de Ruyter, the former Eskom CEO, did last week. He said that he was told by de Ruyter about a senior official allegedly benefiting from corruption at Eskom, but said that the evidence he was given was not sufficient and that de Ruyter was simply alluding to corruption without any definite concerns. He said, yes, de Ruyter has made allusions about certain individuals, but it was precisely that, allusions. As far as the law is concerned, and as far as my understanding of how the law is concerned, I just can't arbitrarily point to someone and say that person is involved in whatever the suggestion is. Gordhan went on to say that he could not rely on rumor, suspicion, or even what a certain publication calls intelligence. There's a distinction between that and evidence. So what he's referring to there is the Daily Maverick, I think it was either yesterday or the day before, published this long piece detailing some of how the corrupt networks operate within Eskom. They say that their sources are former intelligence people who describe the evidence that they were giving them as intelligence. And they laid it all out in this sort of quite detailed article about what's going on in Eskom. So, Makone, now let me start with Chris on this one, actually. Chris, the real question is Gordhan right to dismiss what Andre de Ruyter was saying as simply illusions and that there's no clear evidence here of corruption that he can specifically investigate with regards to senior officials?
I'm trying to be as kind as possible. So I wonder if Gordhan wants to have his cake and eat it too, and in this position now where either you confirm it and then you open yourself up to possible, undercutting, etc., by others in the party and in the movement. So, sort of covering your own back. And then also on the other hand, sort of, I think being technically, by the letter of it, correct around the sort of standard of evidence and all this sort of stuff. We get frustrated and we want things to happen very quickly. So we're, let's have the names, let's have the people in overalls and all that sort of stuff and I can see an argument for that at times, but you also then can't sort of go circumvent processes and procedures as such. Otherwise, maybe the sort of standards and the rule of law, all that stuff we argue for, these things are supposed to follow the right kind of steps to come to the good, necessary, sound and just conclusion. So then on the other hand, I have this in my head where in 2017 Gordhan, around talking about state capture, talked about how to connect the dots. I'm paraphrasing, but that it's there. The corruption is there. It's all clear. I mean, it was started before state capture. It manifested in state capture. All this sort of thing. So maybe I think he's trying to in some ways agree with de Ruyter, but also saying, use the proper forums. Let's follow the steps. Let's do this and that and all that sort of stuff. At the end of the day, that's also a way to maybe hide behind actual accountability and action being taken, because you can say, I trust in the process. I know that the institutions are there, whatever. Those institutions have been hollowed out to a large extent. So it's an element of dodginess, trying to get away from maybe I agree wholeheartedly or I don't. And inevitably, when you've got an overriding sense of pragmatism, in my view, in which this is, evil ultimately triumphs. The wrong can take over when there's just this sort of squishiness in terms of, but it's, it's this, it's that, it's that sort of thing. So I don't know if that's the most satisfactory answer, because I'm trying to define someone who I think inherently tries to dodge and change the target and all that sort of thing. But at this point in time, I think he and many others are trying to shift the focus away from what De Ruyter has alleged and alluded to, and which I think is clearer and clearer by the day, if it wasn't already. I almost wish for De Ruyter personally he didn't go in with these blinkers and think, it's sort of all squeaky clean. And now he's saying, he was surprised by the level of corruption.
There's something that's been really frustrating about all of this, which is that the specific names are kind of missing from all of this. We know from both the Daily Maverick report and from the things that De Ruyter has said that there is someone very senior, and it's implied that it's someone maybe in cabinet or in the upper levels of government. But De Ruyter didn't say specifically who this person was that he was talking about. And the Daily Maverick story itself also says, for legal reasons, they cannot reveal the member. So it's quite sort of frustrating thing of it all being a little bit up in the air. And I think that does create the space for Gordhan to do this thing of saying, because here's what he could say. Here's what Gordhan could say. This is very serious. We as the ANC are very concerned about this. Eskom is our first priority. And even though Andre De Ruyter did not give us sufficient evidence, we're going to investigate it thoroughly to make sure that there's absolutely no hint of wrongdoing here. That's what he could say. But it's kind of interesting to me that he's gone the route of saying, there's nothing here. I can't do anything about this. Makone, firstly, what do you make of that idea of what Gordhan could do? I mean, he doesn't even have to necessarily do anything. It would just be a better public statement to make, to claim that you're going to investigate something, if he just wanted to make himself look better. But firstly, what do you make of that idea that Gordhan is not, if he was taking this seriously, is not playing his best cards? And secondly, what do you make of the ANC's response as a whole to this, to these revelations? Because it's, as we discussed yesterday on the show, it seems like a bee swarm has suddenly been unleashed from the often quite sluggish ANC. What do you make of this?
I think on the Gordhan side of things, I think he finds himself in very familiar territory, right? One, corruption, two, in the ANC ranks. And I will say in his defense that he's one of the only ministers who did something during the state capture era when corruption was lurid red hot, right? He filed an affidavit to interdict the act of Oakbay Investments, forcing him to reverse or negotiate the reversal of the closures of the Oakbay accounts with the South African banks, FNB, Absa, and Nedbank, right? So he immediately, as Minister of Finance, went to the courts, I believe it was in October, to say, hey, stop them from forcing me, because that's what the CEO of Oakbay Investments wanted to do, is to force the Minister of Finance's hand in negotiating the reversal of their bank accounts amid the money laundering claims, which resulted in the closures. So to Pravin's benefit of the doubt, I would say that being the only ANC official and very high-ranking member of government and the ANC, he did something during that era. So I don't think he's asking De Ruyter to do something that he himself has not been willing to do. And I'll also share this part about his affidavit. Is he opposed, obviously, Oakbay Investments forcing him to get involved. And he adds in the affidavit that he further asked the CEO of Oakbay Investments if he was proud of himself, right? Because obviously he has ridiculous access to senior officials of government, and they know what they're doing, right? They want to be freed and relieved from money laundering and the persecution that comes from that. So he, to his benefit of the doubt, I think he has been vocally opposed to corruption, and he says so in the exclusive that he gave Newsroom Africa. He acknowledges that there are cartels that run certain parts of the processes in procurement at Eskom. He acknowledges that. He also sort of berates Gwede Mantashe's statements about De Ruyter being acting as trying to append the government in exposing corruption in Eskom. He makes a comment about that when solicited, and he says that was wrong and there's no place for that in government. So I think people are angry, and I think they're barking up the wrong tree. With particularly being upset with Gordhan not saying or doing more. I think he's asking De Ruyter to do what he himself has done during the state capture era, which is instead of just making these statements and leaving speculation to run crazy across the country, actually do something. Two, I think the ANC, the ANC's comments really just point to how unapologetic they are. They are very well aware of how extensive corruption is in Eskom, and I think they are pushing De Ruyter to act against it, but I almost feel as though it's because they know that he won't do anything and they remain protected from being exposed, which also makes me impatient. I'm one of the people on the lines saying, just give us the names. But to Chris's points, there are processes, legal processes that need to be followed, even if you are exposing corruption. I don't think justifying the means through the ends is a good way to go about this.
Chris, any final thoughts?
It's a useful distraction, maybe, and a nice debate as well. Not always, but now heading up to the elections, which should take place, which hopefully will take place by the latest August of next year. What is to the benefit of the ANC losing support faster or not, or sort of hemorrhaging some of that? I wonder if some of the stuff helps to sap sort of frustration and people's will, having the many points from different angles. Then again, I don't know if I can give them that much credit for having the sort of coordinated campaign of distraction and that sort of thing. But I don't think one should also place these sorts of isolated incidents. It helps to have a broader picture sometimes.
It's also always worth remembering that when we're chasing up very specific corruption allegations, that there are many things that are at the core of this problem, and that you can get rid of all the corrupt people, but as long as you leave some of those structures in place, some of those policies in place, you're just going to get a repeat down the line, right? This is all captured in the Zondo Commission report when they talked about the stuff that was done at Eskom during the Zuma era. It's not clear how much of that has changed because the rules governing Eskom haven't changed that much, namely things like preferential procurement, which has created a massive space for corruption to the benefit of a very small politically connected elite. So if we really want change, we not only need to arrest the people committing illegal acts, but we also need to change the rules so that we can close off the opportunities for corruption. Okay, let's move on to our next story. This is about South Africa's latest unemployment figures. We've seen now unemployment figures for the fourth quarter of 2022, so the end of last year. And it looks like there's some good news. Unemployment did, in fact, drop a little bit. On the official rate, which includes people who have, I think, within the last 2 weeks or so, been actively looking for work, the rate dropped from 32.9% to 32.7%, so a tiny little drop. And the expanded definition of unemployment, which includes people who have given up searching for work, the unemployment rate dropped from 43.1% to 42.6%. So little drop, but any more jobs being created is always good. And this shows that I think there was a net gain of 169,000 jobs, with most of them being in finance, private households, trade, and transport sectors, with social services, agriculture, and construction losing jobs in the same period. Chris, let me start with you again. What do you make of this? Good news? Is this the beginning of a trend? Are things turning around in the unemployment field, or how should we interpret these figures?
On the trying to find the light in a crisis, it indicates a little bit of resilience in the labor market. 0.2% lower than many economists had predicted. So despite the endemic load shedding that has now taken hold and was more pronounced at the end of last year, there is a bit of resilience. But I want to then point to the downside, the upshot of all this, where you've got some more formal sector employment, that sort of thing. But if you look at that sort of feed through of youth and newer younger people who are entering a job market potentially without having necessary skills and job opportunities because of restrictive policies, if you look at just how the total number of unemployed youth increased by 46,000 to 4.6 million. So that trend continues ever upwards. So you've got some resilience in terms of formal employment, but it's not substantive enough, I think, to really bring in the number of people that you need in formal employment and to help them also just improve their own sort of livelihoods, that of themselves, their families, and their communities. And then just the last point that Kevin Lings from Stanlib has highlighted today around job creation sort of around the country. So you had 169,000 jobs being created in Q4, and 168,000 of those were created in the Western Cape.
Oof! if you're an ANC minister, that's not a fun stat to see. Makone, unemployment continues to be, in many senses, the biggest crisis, I think, facing South Africa. If you look at the survey data from the Institute of Race Relations, it finds time and time again that the thing that South Africans are most concerned about, particularly Black South Africans, is the shockingly high level of unemployment in this country, which is one of the worst in the world and has been for a very long time. What do you make of these stats? Do you agree with Chris? What are your thoughts?
Razor thin marginal increases in employment. Would love to see more, of course, but they come on the back of record highs of load shedding in the stage 6s and 5s. So although I'd like to see more, I'm also aware that the economy is handicapped by load shedding. I also think that it's checks out against the fact that companies usually employ around Q4, right? That's when a lot of job applications go out. So it checks out against that cycle. And I suspect if it wasn't for load shedding, we'd be seeing far more meaningful percentages and increases of employment. We've seen countries like the US being managing to decrease their unemployment to record lows on their Q4 figures as well. So I think South Africa is hemorrhaged by load shedding.
Right. And as people pointed out, that we're still not actually back to where we were before the COVID lockdowns in terms of employment. So our recovery, in a certain sense, is still not actually complete, despite the fact that our economy is kind of technically growing again a bit. Chris, any final thoughts we can expect? If you were, do you think that, we've had, I think this year, every single day we've had load shedding, and it doesn't look like that's going to go away anytime soon. In fact, we may even reach new heights of load shedding, stage 8, stage 10. I saw today there was a story from that one of Eskom service providers is drawing up the schedule for load shedding beyond stage 8. It was stage 8, which is always a good sign. What do you think we'll see in the months going ahead?
Yeah, even on the most optimistic view, sort of those who can afford it now, installing solar panels and stuff like that, getting that tax rebate, that still doesn't allow for example, you don't get a rebate on batteries and that other infrastructure that you need as part of your solar capacity. So fine, let's assume that capacity is now being built to some extent. That doesn't come on grid and can deal with grid capacity constraints overnight. So you're only going to see the improvement in terms of maybe some lighter load shedding stages in the next 3 to 5 years, I'd say at the sort of earliest point. The Reserve Bank for this year sees growth at 0.3%. That's down from its 1.1% forecast that it gave last year. At those sort of rates, you're not going to see a meaningful job creation to any extent. So I think sort of unemployment rates hovering around where it is at the moment, potentially worsening depending on seasonal sort of changes and adjustments. But the load shedding, that big growth fundamental for South Africa, isn't going away, that issue, anytime soon. And without that, you don't have sort of concomitant real capital formation, business activity, all that sort of stuff. And also just the final point, given the global sort of environment of more difficult economic conditions, instead of getting that foreign capital investment that you might get here, you're going to get it to other places because, for example, South Africa still has things like expropriation without compensation firmly on the table. So we're just sending the wrong signals. And then lastly, you've got South Africa now being grey listed. So more difficult to get capital into the country. You've increased that risk premium of South Africa now. And the upshot is It's easy to talk about these numbers, GDP, capital, load shedding stages. People's quality of life now is directly impacted. Less access to capital, fewer jobs being created, like less shops opening, all that sort of stuff.
Right. One kind of gets the sense now that our economy is under this kind of, it's a little bit like a desert plant, is that it's sort of desperately trying to continue surviving in this very, very difficult environment. The speculation is, although it hasn't been confirmed yet, that once you go above stage 8, that you start to get 6 hours at a time of outages. So that'll be fun. Right. Chris, you're a guy who's really into logistics. South Africa has recorded a large amount of freight theft across the country. We've seen the situation develop that it's become a routine thing. It started really on the N3, where it became like a real crisis, but it kind of goes on across the whole country, of massive amounts of cargo theft in transit from trucks, from warehouses. And this is hundreds and hundreds of millions of rands lost every single year to these things. There's at least 2,670 incidents of cargo theft across South Africa in the last 18 months. And this was according to a group called the Transport Asset Protection Association. Interestingly, some of the biggest single thefts were a major heist of clothing and footwear stolen from Durban, stealing of cobalt hydroxide, theft of car parts was in the top sort of 10 most valuable thefts that we've seen in the last 18 months. How big of an impact is this having on our economy, and what can government actually do about it?
Yeah, so last week, 2 weeks ago, we had the latest inflation numbers, and it showed a decline from December last year to January, I think, down from 7.2% to 6.9%. And that's obviously good, seeing declining inflation. But on the other hand, you had a almost 14% increase in food and non-alcoholic beverages over that year period. So that's a result of this sort of stuff, of higher transportation costs, security issues, higher fuel costs, and I think also crime, because then businesses, warehouses, farmers, everyone across the value and supply chain, they need to increase their security costs. They need to factor that into the operations in some way, and that gets passed on to consumers. So again, that feeds into, not that we're sort of on the edge of food insecurity, but then you add another factor into that potential, where you've got less access to food, to basic foodstuffs, maybe a higher risk point for certain farmers. They need to close down their operations, and you've got less manufacturing capacity of food. Never mind the manufactured goods and all that sort of stuff we take for granted. I think we think manufactured goods, sort of our consumer culture, these things that save us time, things like washing machines, etc., are going to be around forever, but they need to be manufactured and transported around. And if those costs are too high, then they're simply going to go elsewhere. So that's all, I think, a consequence of what we're seeing now. And then when you add to that the inability in many places, you can't say it across the board, but many places, of the police and intelligence services to break up criminal networks and syndicates, then what options do truckers, farmers, manufacturers really have? You hope to see a bit more sort of future proofing and that resilience, so helping to establish strong community ties, making sure that people understand these things are vital, obviously, for job creation and just some sort of economic activity that could prove more resilient than, for example, waiting for a convoy to come from Pretoria with armored personnel carriers and all that stuff, maybe making it more resilient on the ground, versus waiting for things to happen. Even if we don't have those APCs in the first place, maybe you can at least send 2 of them, but they're going to take way too long to get there in any case.
It's really interesting that you often see the kind of the evidence of the problems facing the sort of logistics industry on little details, like over the past few years, I've noticed that trucks are increasingly that kind of step where you step up to open the back of the truck. Some of them now have spikes on there, or you have these massive locks on them, because the level of theft in so many places is so intense that even just driving around through the streets, you can have people who will jump into the back of a truck and loot it. And this really seems to be part of, as you said, Chris, organized crime stuff. it really does feel like, particularly this year, that we've seen a bit of an acceleration, or maybe it's just all coming to the fore now, of how expansive and deeply entrenched organized crime is across the country. Makone, I get the sense we've got mafias in Eskom, we've got mafias in every government department, we've got mafias in the construction industry, we've got mafias in illegal mining, and we've got mafias operating to knock out transport links. What's your take on all this?
When you see the value of the items that were stolen, right, in the 5 million euros in those different categories that you broke down, it points to how sophisticated the level of crime is happening at this cargo and freight industry. And that South Africa, as they point out, that Transport Asset Protection Association points out, South Africa's created separate crime categories for cargo and freight theft in South Africa. So these are very sophisticated operatives. These are crime syndicates, mafias, as you point out, and they seem to be on the rise in South Africa. Crime seems to be getting more and more sophisticated, as you can expect, with the country moving out of being a developing to an emerging market, a developing country to an emerging market. So one thing that we also point out at the Center for Risk Analysis is that although the reinforcement of the SAPS has been steady over the past, these numbers are not growing. The ratio is something like 1 policeman for every 5 South Africans, right? Despite the increase in crimes, you see that a lot of companies and individuals in South Africa are resorting to private security at a 5x, 7x factor, right? So people are feeling crime on the ground, but there's no reinforcement at the state level. If anything, people are paying extra for private security, and justifiably when you see reasons like this.
Definitely. I think it's actually the kind of untold story of how the country has managed to be, in many senses, more resilient than one would, I think, think on paper, is because in so many places the private sector has kind of made a plan around issues. And actually, on that point, we often hear from government, especially recently, that the businesses need to stop complaining, need to stop whining to the newspapers and come to the fore to help government. But we recently had a comment from Business Unity SA's CEO, who said that this is not really the case when you actually try to engage with government. He said that businesses often feel stonewalled and ignored by government because, quote, there are parts of government that still ideologically do not trust the private sector. There are parts that want to control as much as they can without having the capacity to do anything good and optimal in controlling stuff. And yet the resources and capacity lie in the private sector. And the CEO went on to say, believe you me, if the private sector had not come to the party in the last few years, we would have been in a worse position. The private sector came to the party during COVID-19 and have been to the party since. We have done a phenomenal amount of work on energy, logistics, law and order, all with a view to giving the president 2 pages on each of these and saying that there are 3 things you need to do. If you do this, this is how the dial will shift on investment and growth. And yet they've received almost no engagement from government and say that despite representing quite large businesses or business interests, they often aren't even able to secure meetings with senior government people. Makone, do you agree with Business Unity SA's take that the private sector is doing something and that government has this ideological opposition to them?
Definitely. We've sat through meetings as the CRA with clients who've indicated or asked us actually about inventive ways of trying to secure meetings with government officials so that they can come up with solutions and try really intervene, especially on the load shedding front. And it's frustrating for them as much as it is for us to observe this and watch it happen. But I'm glad to see BUSA finally speak out on behalf of their representatives about how hostile government is to private sector help.
Yes. Chris, any final thoughts before we close up?
Maybe it's naive hope on my part that maybe some of the bigger corporates will stop.
We need some hope in here.
Will they stop playing on government's turf or not? So letting government dictate the sort of frames of reference and all that sort of stuff versus maybe now taking the next step forward. I mean, you had Adrian Gore saying he hopes that the private sector and public sector will work together more from the discovery side. So, where is the differentiation going to come? Is it just talk and no action? Yeah, let's see.
Definitely something to keep an eye on, and I think it would do business good to ask forgiveness rather than seeking permission in many cases. Anyway, thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed the show, and we will be back tomorrow on the Daily Friendship. Cheers, everyone.